What does it mean to be a patriot? What makes up a national identity? Can someone's personal identity, through things like gender and sexuality, become a threat or aid to the creation of the national identity? Consistent buzzwords like manosphere and womanosphere, and countless discussions about the transgender community in the workforce have been placed all throughout our media. But really, does it mean anything? What exactly are people talking about when it comes to these things like gender fluidity and how it can pose a threat to what it means to be American? Does it actually? And why? With all of these questions up in the air, I actually encountered this sci-fi novel. The Left Hand of Darkness was written by Ursula K. Le Guin in 1969, shortly after the civil rights movements in the United States. This novel takes place on the genderless world of Gethin. This novel follows Genli I, a human from a world much like our own, who is sent to make a deal with Gethin to join the Enkerman Alliance for Trade and Prosperity. However, with Gethinians' fluid genders, Genli faces obstacles in understanding Gethin's world as a whole. Among all of their practices surrounding chemering, one thing still seems to stand out. Gethin is a warless world. Wars between nations have not existed on Gethin throughout the course of its history. In fact, when Genli lands on Gethin, it's when these nationalistic ideals between these two nations, Karhayat and Argarian.
Argarian?
Orgarin. These two nations are put up against each other with completely opposite ideals, and the people of Gethin are now facing what could possibly evolve into a war. However, Gethin is not a primordial world, so it really begs into question, why has Gethin not experienced a war up until now? In Le Guin's original essay, Is Gender Necessary?, she actually talks about how gender is a more minuscule part of her book. She wanted to include this duality between these worlds that absolves a lot of the binaries and in turn takes away a lot of what creates war. Le Guin revisits this essay, and she actually says that gender is an essential part. It's because of the flipping of the gender binary that Gethin actually experiences throughout the book that actually leads to this warless world. She actually removes the destructive ideals usually attached to gender. With the lack of a gender hierarchy, more flexible and communal practices are held in Gethin. Things like parenting and labor become shared responsibilities, and places like Kemmer houses aren't attached to the usual constraints of gender and sexuality. It's because of this integrated, community-built society that Gethin has experienced throughout its history that actually leads to nationalism and patriotism not taking form on a larger scale. Then again though, how does the gender binary, and rather the disruption of it, actually contribute to the changes that we see in the book? With this, we have to examine how gender and nationalism and patriotism all play a hand in each other. And in fact, gender is a foundational trait of what creates a nation. Patriotism's definition often gets tossed around, but is usually correlated to the loyalty and pride someone has in their own nation. Patriotism emerges from the root patria, associated with not just the homeland, but the root for the word father. Nationalism, on the other hand, is often seen as the extension of patriotism and the desire to have one's nation founded and protected as a state. With nationalism, words like the motherland emerge in discussions surrounding the desire for statehood. Because of this, nationalism is embedded in unification of the different groups under one nation-state. We can say that nationalism is a form of patriotism that functions as a symbol, to politically legitimate the values shared by a given association that pictures itself as a community, regardless of all members knowing each other. This is especially seen in the interactions between the two main characters, Genli and Estraven, a native of Gethin. Genli takes patriotism as what we usually define it as, which is this pride in the nation and thus forth a loyalty in it. However, Estraven says something that becomes the quite opposite, but then the ingranation of the difference between Gethin and the world that Genli comes from, the one most similar to us. Because on the other hand, Estraven says this: "No, I don't mean love when I say patriotism. I mean fear, the fear of the other, and its expressions are political, not poetical. Hate, rivalry, aggression. It grows in us, that fear. It grows in us year by year." However, it's in these differences that we actually see greater correlations to Genli connected to us in real life. Obviously, there is no worlds that we know currently without the gender binary, and masculinity and nationalism actually play a role hand in hand upon further research. As I said before, the ideas of patriotism and nationalism in our very language is ingrained in the idea of gender, from patriotism to the motherland, something that patriots must protect and must fight for, become an essential part of how we see gender on a national scale, and thus how it's actually viewed throughout the world. Men's virtues lie in the idea of men being soldiers, their courage, their strength, and their loyalty to their nation. This forms the idea of patriotism. Throughout history, we see this in the reliance of masculinity in times of revolution, in the ideas that in order for a nation to be powerful, the men must be the most masculine that they could possibly be. Masculinity can also be defined in when men are not, attributing this binary to be the opposite of femininity. And thus, whenever men are labeled as feminine, as emotional, as vulnerable, they're also attributed to be cowards. Of course, this plays into role with the misogyny that comes with these nationalistic views. The idealistic version of masculinity has become the norm, but many people don't realize that this idealistic, perfect masculine figure is unattainable, and that is where the harmful traits of masculinity come from. We see Genli perpetrate this misogyny when he finds things that he distrusts about Estraven inherently feminine, projecting these ideals onto Estraven's androgyny. Masculinity and nationalism seem stamped from the same mold, a mold which has shaped important aspects of the structure and culture of the nations and states in the modern state system. On the other hand, to be feminine in the relation to a nation is actually to be passive and symbolic of what the nation is, but never actually take an active role in it. It's no wonder that the cult of domesticity actually evolved in the mid-19th century during a time of revolution, especially in Europe and in America, where new social ideals were being formed around this new nation. In the novel, there is only one female narrator, Opung, a fellow Ekumen who recorded information on Gathinians long before Genli's arrival. Despite her identity as a woman, she struggled to phrase her findings without gendering the Gathinians, often labeling them as masculine. In fact, she elaborates these ideas, often using colonial language. Another thing that someone has to take in mind when it comes to gender is that it is a colonial structure. Thus, the idea of the dominant masculine is associated with the colonizer, and the submissive feminine is associated with the colonized. The enforcing of colonial language and imagery contributes to the imperial position of the Enkumen and the misunderstood Gathinians. As the Enkumen label Gathinians as colonial bodies, with a masculine desire for power in Opong's eyes, but a feminine presentation in Genli's, it calls out their lack of awareness to the erasure of gender expectations. This leads back to why there is no war on Gethin and the imagery that exists alongside it. And that is why there's a lot of imagery in war about rape, about the idea of taking advantage of the colonized, of the oppressed. War is actually associated with violence against women. What it means to be a soldier in a war means to be a man who's willing to commit these brutalities against the women of another nation. There's actually no such thing as non-consensual sex, rape, or even such a thing as sexual frustration. From their schedules to the way that their households are built, everything surrounds the period of Kemmering in which they experience this reproductive urge to become a man or woman depending on their partner. But it's really curious how the idea behind rape is non-existent in Gethin because of Kemmering. The biggest problem with the narration taking place from Genli and people like Opong and the other Enkumen is that they are constantly projecting their gender onto the Gathinians. The main criticism that people have toward this book is that very truth. The fact that this book never actually redefines or explores what it means to be beyond man or woman. Because we read this novel from the perspective of the Enkumen, both from their translations to their writings, we actually never escape this projection of man or woman until Genli actually takes it upon himself to deconstruct that idealized version. This actually causes the greatest development in Genli. With the portrayals that do exist of nationalism and patriotism in The Left Hand of Darkness, they are often embedded in the idea of fear, especially after Estraven leaves his position and is taken over by his political rival Tibe. In his radio speeches, Tibe refers to the Orgada as enemies of our nation and promotes violence against them, calling Karhaidish farmers that went and murdered a village of Orgada as brave Karhaidish farmers, true patriots. For the very first time, under King Agravin that fed on fear and the wide political rule of Tibe, the uprisings on Gethin began to be more than just quarrels and unpredictable conflicts. Genli learns to redefine what he believed patriotism was, especially after Straven revisits his earlier statement in light of these events. What is love of one's country? Is it hate of one's own country? I love the hills of the domain of Estre, but that sort of love does not have a boundary line of hate. Estraven is Tibe's direct foil, politically and morally, but it is with Genli put in the middle of their differences that nationalistic events like this begin to take place. Now that the unification is needed between the two nations to reach a peaceful deal with the Ekumen, both are scrambling for power. By introducing a gender perspective, the Ekumen spread ideas of patriotism and nationalism that previously would have never taken ground in Gethin. It's through the eyes of Genli that we can take our own perspective, see ourselves through Genli, and thus analyze the book from the perspective of people who have never known anything but the gender binary because of the forming of nations in our real world. We will never absolve ourselves of gender. We will never be able to solve the divisions between man or woman because it's what makes up the nations that we live in. So the real question is, how do we take this sci-fi novel in which gender doesn't exist and actually apply it to our real world where gender will always exist? To quote Le Guin's very words in the introduction to this novel, science fiction is not predictive, it's descriptive. Le Guin isn't trying to say that we are ever going to evolve to a genderless future like Gethin. Instead, this unattainable world is supposed to teach us about ourselves by reflecting what we don't have. The ideas of gender and nationalism in our real world is ingrained on the idea of division and difference. To answer the question, does escaping the gender binary threaten national identity? Yes. Our nations were built on the idea that to be a man is to be a soldier, and to be a woman is to be a symbol of the nation. So of course, anyone escaping the gender binary is completely defying everything that we know about the way our societies are built. The way that we come together as a nation, as a community, is built still on division. The reason it's such a threat to patriotism is because patriotism is built on the harmful, the misogynistic, the idealistic versions of masculinity and femininity and everything relating to the gender binary. But if we take works like The Left Hand of Darkness and we realize how someone like Genli can learn about not only other people but himself through finally escaping the gender binary, we can challenge the national identity by removing the harmful traits about it to begin with. By accepting the historical background in the relationship between gender and the building of a nation, we can begin to move along to a future where escaping the binary is no longer seen as something harmful, but as something that we can use to promote our understanding of each other and the communities within our nation.